Did COVID-19 come from food on our dining table? The answer remains unknown. But one thing is for sure. What we eat matters a lot to public health. To some, COVID-19 adds to the necessity to change the global food system, namely the animal food-dominated food system. But is animal food the culprit of this global pandemic? What dangers does animal food pose to public health compared to plant food? Is it time to offer a meat-free world? And what alternatives do we have to replace natural animal food? To answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Joyce Da Silva, Ambassador Emeritus of the Compassion in World Farming, Gunhild Stordalen, the founder of Executive Chair of EAT, Martin Bloom, Director for the Center for a Livable Future of the Johns Hopkins, and Dr. Shenggen Fan, Chair Professor at the College of Economics and Management at China Agricultural University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So the origin of COVID-19 probably remains unclear, and scientists are still delving into this. But Dr. Stordalen, do you think there might be a possible connection between the pandemic and the global food system? To be more specific, the livestock-related food system.
Yes, and the links between food production and zoonotic diseases and the global spread of such diseases are very complex, and it cannot be fixed by simply closing down wet markets. But one thing is for sure, and that is that food systems are at the heart of it. And nothing else we do comes close to how food production and food are causing environmental harm. And our food has also become the #1 risk factor for disease and early deaths in the world, and is now killing more people than alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and unsafe sex combined. And in the context of the COVID pandemic, our food systems are actually both a contributing cause, and it's making the impacts worse. It's a cause because COVID-19, like 60% of other emerging infectious diseases, is a zoonosis, and that is caused by a virus jumping from animals to humans. Mm-hmm. And while wildlife trade and wet markets play a role, this is also about unsustainable food production. And today we know that agriculture is the #1 driver of ecosystems and habitat loss, which increases the connection between animals and people and increases the risk of virus spillovers. And like we have seen in the past with bird flu and swine flu, industrialized so-called factory farms where thousands of animals are packed together in very small spaces, that is also a breeding ground for zoonotic diseases. And on the impact side, the pandemic or the food system makes the pandemic actually much more deadly and costly, and overweight, obesity, and diseases related to unhealthy diets are one of the leading risk factors for severe disease and also dying from the virus. And it was just a paper out showing that patients with obesity has up to 50% increased risk of dying. So in short, modern food production and consumption are undermining the main shields protecting us from harms, which are healthy ecosystems and healthy diets.
And Dr. Fan, do we know any epidemic in human history that has been proved to be caused by eating animals?
Well, not directly, but definitely the zoonotic diseases have been connected with the food system. The human being and animal share lots of diseases. So at any time, if the conditions are right, these diseases can jump into human beings. So the evidence is clear. Probably 60 to 80% of our human infectious diseases are related to animals or come from animals. So that leads us to rethink of our food system. What sort of food system do we want to have in the future? So even before the COVID-19, our world already has 680 million hungry people. 2 billion people suffer from lack of macronutrients, hidden hunger, and 2 billion people are overweight and obese. So we already had a problem. And COVID-19 obviously made the case even worse. So right now, for 2020, globally, we have more than 130 more acute hungry people in the world. So in addition to nutrition and the health of our future system that we need to take into consideration, I think we must conserve our natural resources, keep some distance from nature.
So if that is the problem with the current food system, what is the alternative? Joyce, does that mean that we will give up eating meat at all and instead we'll all go vegetarian?
Well, I think probably in 100 years' time that might be the case. And it may well be driven by these animal origin diseases. By eating so much meat, we're not doing ourselves any favors. We're harming our health. There's no doubt that increased levels of obesity, type 2 diabetes, some heart diseases, and certain cancers are linked to consumption of meat, particularly red meat. I mean, the World Health Organization has said that processed meat, like hams and salamis, are carcinogenic. They are cancer-causing, and that red meat is probably carcinogenic. So those things need to be cut. But while we're harming ourselves, we're actually harming creation, because we're farming more and more land and disturbing wildlife and losing biodiversity. Now, the animals that we actually keep in factory farms, which is the majority of the 70 billion animals we slaughter every year, they live lives of absolute misery. So, you know, it's really important that we find a farming system which treats animals with respect. They're sentient beings. They share this planet with us. We shouldn't be crowding 40,000 chickens in a shed. It's bad for them. It makes it very easy for viruses to jump from one chicken to another and eventually perhaps mutate to infect us with another pandemic. It's bad for the chickens. It's bad for pigs that are kept in very crowded conditions. All these animals, why can't we let them have a quality of life? So I think overall, for the near future, we have to drastically reduce our consumption of animal products.
And Martin, what is your thinking on the current food system? Is it the problem of meat eating, or is it more the food production and distribution mechanism itself?
Well, thanks for the question. I think the situation is, of course, quite complex. Now, from a health and nutrition perspective, it's even more complex. We have still a lot of malnutrition in the world. And many children, to prevent stunting, you need some animal source food, particularly milk and maybe some eggs. But what the previous speakers all have said, we consume an enormous amount of meat in Europe and in the US and even in Latin America, and the trend of an increased meat consumption, particularly in Asia, is extremely high. And we don't need that amount. So the discussion about whether we need protein or not should be more nuanced. As a child, most probably you need, some animal source food. But as an adult, you definitely don't need the amount we consume, and even much less. So, but also from a health perspective, I would say, for example, if you look at China, China is a very interesting country who, had a relatively low meat consumption. You look 50 years ago, but nowadays the trend is really increasing the amount, and they are now at a level which definitely they don't need to increase. And like what's happening in the US and in Europe, we definitely need to decrease our meat consumption. Besides the consumption, I think it's also the production. I dealt in the last 3 years a lot with animal food production, and it's just really, really dangerous for human health. You think about the workers, you think about the way we produce it, and antibiotic resistance. So there is a lot of health aspects related with, in fact, the way we produce food. Besides the spillover effects, which already has been mentioned, of course, of all the zoonoses. And this is something we are now dealing with COVID-19, but this is not just disease in isolation. We can expect much more spillover effects in the future. And this is why I think we need to be really careful how we produce our food. And that means, in fact, that we have to go for alternative forms, also based on climate. But if we go for alternative forms, then automatically, of course, we need to reduce the intake. And I think the chance of many countries like what we see in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, but also Latin America, we have the chance not to make the same mistakes that we have seen in the US and in Europe, with this incredible increase of obesity and diabetes and you know, even cancers. So I think it's also what we see, of course, a lot of entitlement, as meat is the only way, you know, the future, you know, if you get richer as a country, that you need to eat more meat.
But then,
I'm not saying that everyone should be vegetarian. I agree that most probably will not happen in the next 100 years. But I do feel that, like, you know, you don't need more than 40, 50, 60 gram, like on average a day. And you know, you look at the consumption of some of the countries, which is outrageous. So, you know, from a health perspective, it's definitely very good to reduce your meat consumption, but also from a production
but when you
climate
look at from a business perspective, both the demand from those middle classes in developing countries are rising for meat, and the supply, the industrialized food industry is looking for business opportunities to ramp up their productions. Where does the incentives come from to reduce reliance on meat?
I think it will come from health. I think once people know the cancer risk, the risk of heart disease and so on from eating too much meat, I think that's probably what's going to make them reduce their meat consumption, because we're all basically self-centered beings. And others will reduce their meat consumption because they care about animals or the environment or the horrendous climate change that's happening at the moment, which, you know, animal production is a significant contributor to that. But I think ultimately, probably, it will be health.
And Dr. Stodon, I know the Eat Lancet Commission has a report, Food in Anthropocene, got a lot of attention in 2019, and your organization, EAT, played a role in organizing and supporting it. How would you summarize your findings?
Well, the main message from the Eat Lancet Commission is that it's indeed possible to feed everyone on the planet enough healthy food, even as the population grows to 10 billion by 2050. And we can do so without destroying our climate, our oceans, our soils, and our forests. But this will only be possible if we drastically change how we produce our food and what we put on our plates and stop wasting. And we must start producing food in a way that is in harmony with nature, that replenishes our soil, that absorbs and stores carbon rather than emitting it. And we must stop chopping down the forest and converting nature and ecosystems into crop and grazing lands. And in practice, this means that we have to feed another 2 billion more people, and we have to do so on existing agricultural land. And we also have to shift to healthy and much more plant-based diets, vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grains, fruits. And we have to cut dramatically back on ultra-processed and healthy foods, and sugar and sugary drinks and animal proteins. And particularly in the Western world, we must eat much less meat, less but better quality, and that especially goes for red meats. And on top of this, we have to at least halve food waste and loss. And today, I mean, it's crazy. We throw away or destroy 1/3 of everything that is produced. And the conclusion is also that if we do all of these things and in parallel, not only can we help tackle climate change and protect nature and the planet, but we can save as much as 11 million lives every year, and we can improve the health and well-being of hundreds of millions more.
But isn't that the key? Can we do those things in parallel? That sounds a very ambitious goal you've been talking about.
There is no silver bullet or quick fix. but again, the science shows that this is possible. It's totally doable. But we need a whole new global action agenda around food systems. We need changes and reforms in policy, in business practice, in investments.
Martin,
to pandemic.
you want to
Yeah,
add something?
I like to say what is really interesting is you look, like I lived in Asia for a very long time of my career, and the way, for example, people consume their food in Asia is very much linked with, in fact, a much lower intake of meat. Besides, of course, originally was a lot of poverty was still a major.
But they're looking for more
driving.
intake of meat as a symbol of better life quality.
No, absolutely. No, we understand that. But at the same time, if you look at more from a diet perspective, like a lot of the way people eat, consume things, that meat is actually a component of, for example, the way the dishes have been made. And it's very different if you look at, for example, a Western diet where you have potatoes and vegetables and, for example, a piece of meat. That's different, for example, in Asia. And so a lot of tofu, for example, is used as a protein source in many Asian countries. And that's, for example, a way to do it. Now, a lot of the production of soy is actually used for the animal production instead of actually used as a protein source for people. So from a traditional perspective, I can see that countries who don't have yet the high intake of meat could actually really have a nice mixture. That's why I think what Gunhild was not prescribing, of course, but describing is actually possible in many places. The transition of poorer countries to richer countries, yes, they will increase their meat consumption, but they don't have to do it in a similar way as what we have seen in Europe and North America as well as in Latin America. So,
I think the problem is, we failed miserably in policy. All these actions, all the wishes we wanted to have, whether people still behave like what they have behaved, I think we must fix policy. For example, now we spend so much money on subsidizing feed, maize, and also staple crops. When you subsidize feed, you basically subsidize the animal food production.
Yeah.
And then you don't have much money to support the production of more nutritious and healthy foods, vegetables, fruits, beans, and so on. So I think Gunhild mentioned about the ministers of finance. I think we should be more specific. Ask them to stop subsidizing unsustainable, unhealthy foods, and use that money to produce healthy and nutritious. I think even more so, we can tax unhealthy and unsustainable foods, because there are some externalities, environmental costs, health costs are not priced into all these foods.
But Dr. Van, do you think the governments at different countries are on the same page with the experts' view? Because obviously they need taxes from the food industry, they need to feed their people well, and even better. Can they make that decision based on your suggestions? Is that realistic?
Yeah, I think there is a global effort in doing that. I think China is part of that, in reforming the government subsidies. But we know that subsidies do not produce healthy, nutritious foods. They are not sustainable. They are not efficient in terms of using resources. I think the old tradition of so-called food self-sufficiency, including now we need to eat more meat as part of prosperity, that minding needs to be changed. I think we've got to eat more diverse diet. Some fruits, vegetables, actually more fruits, more vegetables, some nuts, fish, and obviously some main proteins, particularly seafood.
Let's take a short break, and we'll be coming back to talk about what kind of a food system are we looking at with less reliance on meat. Don't go away, we'll be right back. And earlier we talked about how COVID-19 might change people's eating habits. And Dr. Van, what about the technology's role in changing the food culture? Of course, food is not just something we eat is also a way of life. We like to taste good food. Will technology solve that problem? We've been told that cellular agriculture is allowing people to grow animal tissue from cells. Will that become the new trend so that we don't eat actual meat? We can eat plant-based meat and taste just as well.
Yeah. Well, I have tasted so-called Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat. It tastes really good. I really like it. And if we
the same as a real burger?
Yeah, just like a real. We did some blind tests. The people couldn't tell the difference. And they can really save water, land, or even biodiversity, reduce the carbon emission by 80 to 90%.
But it's still more expensive than traditional burger. Will that make a business model?
Well, I think really depends on consumers' acceptance. I think here in China, the consumers are still reluctant to taste something new. I do think we needed to expand and experiment in different parts of the cities, like Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou. Well, let's see, whether the consumers can access to this sort of plant-based meat. And well, obviously, the industry needs to continue to improve the taste. And I think the government needs to do a better job, not only in terms of the business model, but also in terms of nutrition. Martin can probably tell us better. I think still question whether this Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat will have the same sort of even better nutrition benefits. I think this is still a good question. I mean, economically, environmentally, I can see a good business case. But we need a nutritionist. Look at the nutrition side.
And Joyce, can you imagine a post-meat world where everybody's enjoying their food but without eating meat?
Well, I think it's perfectly possible. And, if everyone tried it for a week, they'd probably find they enjoyed it. And it's interesting you saying about would the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat burgers be acceptable in China. But I've already, in China, eaten some of the best vegan food based on seitan, which has been used in China for years to produce, look-alikes, taste-alike.
But now it's still a choice for a very minority a group of people.
Yeah, and I don't think the Impossible Burger is going to solve the problems of undernutrition in developing countries at all. But, there are all these wonderful foods we already have, the lentils, the beans, and so on, and cereals which are also high protein, like quinoa and so on. If we create those kind of diets and make them available to everyone, I think maybe that, coupled with the health risks from meat and concern for the environment and climate change, will drive people towards increasingly plant-based diets. And I think that's got to be better for them, better for all of us, better for the planet, and better for all kinds of animals, wild animals, and the animals we farm.
Martin,
can I just...
Doctor,
yeah.
you want to chip in?
No, just add to that, because in US and Europe, we have seen an explosion in the offerings of plant-based meat and dairy substitutes. Is actually the fastest growing segment in food retail these days. And this is only driven by consumer demands. Because once you get something that is as nutritious, it's much better for the planet, it's better for the animals, and it tastes the same or as good, then it's simply a good deal. And once you start, as Schengen was talking about, once we start talking about true cost accounting and internalize all the externalities, all the damage that our food is causing today, those products will be even much cheaper. But when the volume is going up, the price are already going down. So I'm really confident that this will be one of the many solutions.
But that will be a devastating shock to the current food industry insiders. So Martin, do you foresee the disappearance of the industrialized animal raising, livestock, and fishery in any time soon?
Well, I think your question is really important because you talk about the economic cost, no?
Yeah.
And currently, it's very clear that the cost of meat is relatively very cheap in, for example, in the US and in Europe. You know, again, what the previous speakers have said, like, you know, we have to look at the total cost, the real cost, like the externalities, because at the moment, for example, if you look at the impact of the COVID-19 on, for example, the workers who work in slaughterhouses, it's all over the world that, in fact, they have an increased risk of for example, getting the disease and also even dying. But also, if you look at, for example, what I mentioned before, the antibiotic resistance. So a lot of the cost of the food is not actually calculated, and so the profit will be much less if, in fact, the government will step in and say, now we are paying for, in fact, the profit for many of the industries. And I think, for example, in China, I can see that.
Are you suggesting the government is putting a meat tax?
It's a matter of if you look at the real cost of meat production, it would be definitely whatever the mechanism would be from a policy perspective. But if you would, now in fact the cost is paid by the whole population and not by the industry. And if you really would calculate the negative externalities of the cost of meat, you will see that, in fact, a lot of the alternatives, what Gunil already mentioned, will be actually relatively cheaper than many of the costs of meat. So, for example, to destroy what's happening now in Brazil, the implications of the forest, which is destroyed now because of the soy production, which is used for feed, both in Europe as well as in, for example, in the rest of the world, that has huge implications for costs in many other fields. And those are not actually calculated in the cost of meat.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we know that of the 600 billion in governmental agricultural subsidies, just a few percentage goes to actually nature-positive production. And yeah, we need to change the way we subsidize or what we subsidize, and we need to put true cost accounting in place. But I think as important and much easier for governments to do is to actually start investing massively in R&D for scaling up production of healthy, nutritious food. Because producing legumes and fruits and vegetables are not as profitable today as they could be. So I think there is a massive opportunity to actually use the carrots as an immediate step, because we need to, at the global level, more than double production of those healthy, nutritious foods.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that too. I think it's not the production side, but also the whole value chain development of fruits, vegetables, beans, and so on.
Absolutely.
Make them cheaper, make them more accessible to poor.
Even as fast food. Fast food doesn't have to be junk food. It can be healthy and nutritious and sustainable. But we need R&D and we need investments for that to happen.
All right, we're running out of time. We definitely need more time to talk about this. It's going to be a systematic approach to solve such a huge problem for all human beings. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Stordalen. Thank you, Mr. Fan. Thank you, Martin and Joyce. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.